In the quiet warmth of her stuga, Hanne finds mindfulness in the rhythmic preparation of kanelbullar. As friends and mysterious spirits gather against the winter chill, a simple evening of tea and stories begins to soften the tensions of the waking world. Listen on to experience a gentle journey toward profound peace and collective warmth. The rhythm of the knead. The dough resisted. Hanne pressed the heels of her palms into the pale, elastic mass, feeling the stubborn tension of the gluten fighting back against her. It was a heavy, cool weight on the flowered oak tabletop, a surface scarred by decades of rolling pins and knife slips. The kitchen clock, a heavy brass piece inherited from the previous tenant, ticked with a slow, deliberate cadence that seemed to pull the very air into a lingering stretch. Hanne didn't mind the resistance. She leaned her weight forward, shifting her center of gravity, and pushed the dough away from her body, then folded it back with a rhythmic, sweeping motion. She began to hum. It was a wordless, low-frequency melody that vibrated in her chest, a sound she had carried with her from the city, but only ever let out here, where the walls didn't echo with the noise of sirens or the frantic clicking of keyboards. Each breath was timed to the fold. Inhale as the dough stretched, exhale as it compressed. The rhythm was a tether, grounding her to the present moment. In the corner of the room, Bossy, a large ginger cat with a notched ear, watched her with half-closed eyes. He was curled into a tight, warm sphere on the rug, his paws kneading the wool in a mimicry of Hanne's own movements, his purring a low subterranean rumble that harmonized with her humming. Between the folds, Hanne reached for the mortar and pestle. The cardamom pods were small, green, and dried, smelling of distant suns and ancient trade routes. As she ground them, the stone pestle crunching against the ceramic base, the aroma erupted. It was a sharp, citrusy spice that sliced through the lingering dampness of the winter morning, filling the small kitchen with a scent that felt like a physical embrace. She paused, closing her eyes, letting the fragrance settle in her sinuses. The smell was a catalyst, a bridge between the sterile silence of the library she had left behind and the textured, living silence of the seaside village. She reached for the water and the yeast, but as she touched the side of the pot, a flicker of realization crossed her face. The water was cold. She had been so lost in the meditative flow of the kneading that she had forgotten to pre-warm the liquid. The yeast, dormant and stubborn in the chill, refused to bloom. When she mixed it into the flour, the dough didn't surrender to the warmth of her hands. Instead, it remained stiff, a cold lump of resistance that felt more like clay than bread. Hanne stopped. She didn't sigh or curse the mistake. Instead, she stepped back, the flour dusting her apron like a light snowfall. She slowly rubbed her palms together, the friction creating a small, precious heat that she cherished. This was the lesson of the coast. Things happened at their own pace, and forcing the rhythm only led to exhaustion. She studied the stiff dough and accepted it. The cold was simply another ingredient, a reminder that the house and the weather were partners in the baking process. She would work with the cold, massaging the dough with a slower, more deliberate patience, allowing her own body heat to coax the life back into the mixture. After a long while, the dough finally yielded, becoming supple and smooth under her touch. She transferred the mass into a wide ceramic bowl. The glaze, a deep forest green that mirrored the pines outside. She reached for a heavy linen cloth, one woven from thick, cream-colored threads, and draped it over the bowl. She tucked the edges tight, creating a small, insulated sanctuary for the yeast to wake up. The cloth acted as a barrier against the draft, trapping the warmth of the room and the latent heat from the stove. Hanne moved to the kettle, which had just begun to whistle. She poured the steaming water into a chipped porcelain mug, the scent of Earl Grey mingling with the lingering cardamom. Leaning against the counter, she watched the steam curl into the air in lazy, translucent ribbons. In the silence, the phantom anxieties of her former life. The deadlines, the rigid filing systems, the constant pressure to be productive, felt like echoes from a distant, fading dream. Here, the only deadline was the rise of the bread. She felt her shoulders drop an inch, her jaw unclench, and her breath deepen, filling her lungs with the scent of cinnamon and salt air. As she sipped her tea, her gaze wandered to the window. The glass was old and slightly warped, distorting the view of the gray Atlantic and the jagged coastline. On the windowsill sat a small, hand-carved wooden figure of a man with a long beard and a pointed red hat. It was a gift from the previous owner, a token to appease the Nisei of the house. Hanne had always smiled at the superstition, but she noticed that the figure had shifted since this morning. It was now facing the oven, its tiny wooden eyes fixed on the bowl of dough. A sudden, playful draft flickered through the room, though the window was shut tight, and a tea towel she had left on the counter vanished, sliding silently behind the spice rack. Hanne didn't chase the towel. She simply smiled, a soft, melodic sound escaping her throat. She knew the house had its own inhabitants, invisible architects of domestic harmony who appreciated a well-kept hearth and the scent of fresh cinnamon. She allowed herself a moment of absolute stillness, listening to the distant crash of waves against the cliffs and the rhythmic ticking of the brass clock. The world outside was cold, frozen in the grip of a Nordic winter, but inside the kitchen there was a simmering golden warmth. An hour passed. Hanne set her mug down and stepped toward the ceramic bowl. This was the moment of truth. She reached out and lifted the heavy linen cloth, expecting to see the dough having doubled in size, a soft, pillowy cloud of potential. Instead, the dough sat exactly where she had left it. It was flat, pale, and stubbornly small. She frowned, leaning closer. The dough wasn't just unrisen, it felt chilled to the touch, as if a block of ice had been pressed against the side of the bowl. She looked toward the window and noticed a thin, crystalline line of frost had crept across the inner pane, despite the heat of the stove. There was a gap in the window frame, a hairline fracture in the seal that had allowed a needle of Arctic air to pierce the warmth of the kitchen. The draft had acted like a surgical strike, freezing the yeast in its tracks just as it had begun to stir. Hanne stared at the lifeless dough, the silence of the kitchen suddenly feeling heavier. It wasn't a failure of skill, but a reminder that the house was still testing her, still negotiating the terms of her residency. As she reached to move the bowl closer to the fire, she noticed something odd on the tabletop. Beside the bowl, etched into the dusting of flour that remained on the wood, was a tiny, perfect footprint, too small for a human, too defined for a cat. It pointed directly toward the cellar door, which had creaked open just a fraction of an inch. The tile stove sanctuary. Bossy let out a sharp, demanding chirp that sliced through the kitchen stillness, followed by the heavy thud of a 10-pound cat claiming the center of the tile stove. He didn't just land, he anchored himself, spreading his paws wide across the heat-soaked ceramic with a proprietary air. Hanne paused, her fingers still dusted with a fine layer of flour, watching as the ginger cat curled his tail around his nose, transforming himself into a living, breathing barricade of fur. She needed to reach the oven. The rolls, now finally recovered from their frozen slump and having risen into pillowy mounds, were waiting for the heat. But the tile stove was the heart of the kitchen, a massive, white-glazed beast of a heater that occupied the narrowest stretch of the floor. To get to the oven door, Hanne had to pass within an inch of Bossy's flank. She took a tentative step forward, the woven wool of the rug cushioning her heel. Bossy didn't open his eyes, but he shifted his weight, sliding a few inches to the left with a slow, deliberate motion that effectively sealed the passage. He let out a long, rattling sigh, his whiskers twitching in a way that suggested any attempt to displace him would be met with a profound, sleepy indignation. "You are a very small king for such a large territory," Hanne said, her voice a soft, melodic murmur that trailed off into a gentle, downward inflection. Bossy responded by kneading the ceramic tile with one paw, the claws clicking faintly against the glaze. He didn't move. He simply existed as an obstacle of warmth and stubbornness. Hanne didn't push him. She knew the rules of the stuga. In this house, the hierarchy was governed not by ownership, but by who could best embody the art of stillness. She adjusted her posture, slowing her breath to match the rhythmic rise and fall of the cat's ribs. Instead of fighting the blockade, she began to move in slow, tender circles, her path a wide arc that skirted the edges of the room. She navigated the kitchen like a dancer in a very small theater, stepping carefully around the heavy oak table and the rack of drying herbs, her movements mindful and fluid. As she circled, she caught the reflection of the hearth fire in Bossy's amber eyes. He had cracked one eyelid open, watching her with a gaze that was half judgmental and half affectionate. Then the sound started. It began as a low-frequency vibration, a subterranean hum that seemed to resonate not just in the air, but in the very floorboards beneath Hanne's feet. It was a professional purr, a sonic anchor that tethered the room to a sense of absolute safety. Hanne stopped for a moment, closing her eyes and letting the sound wash over her, feeling the tension in her shoulders dissolve into the warmth of the room. She thought of the city, a memory that now felt like a garment that no longer fit. She remembered the jarring, metal-sharp shriek of the subway brakes at 6 a.m. and the way the air always tasted of exhaust and urgency. In the library, the silence had been a fragile thing, often punctured by the aggressive clicking of keyboards or the hushed, frantic whispers of students during finals week. It had been a silence born of suppression, a void where noise was forbidden but never truly gone. Here, on the coast, the silence was different. It was a presence, a heavy, velvet cloak that wrapped around the house. It was a silence that invited you to listen to the things that actually mattered. The sigh of the wind through the pine needles, the distant, rhythmic crash of the North Sea against the jagged cliffs, and the steady, comforting heartbeat of a cat on a stove. She smiled, a slow expression that didn't reach for a reason, and began the final approach to the oven. She moved with a deliberate grace, treating the space around Bossy as a sacred perimeter. With a careful reach, she slid the baking sheets into the oven. The heat hit her skin in a sudden, aromatic wave, smelling of toasted butter and the deep, woody sweetness of cinnamon. She closed the door with a soft click, the oven's internal light casting a golden glow across the linoleum. The house settled into a deep, humming silence. The only sound was the occasional pop and crackle of the pine logs in the hearth, sending tiny sparks dancing up the chimney. Hanne leaned against the counter, rubbing her palms together for warmth, her mind drifting into the slow current of the afternoon. The world felt paused, as if the winter solstice had frozen time itself, leaving her in this small, warm pocket of existence where the only deadline was the timer on the stove. She felt a profound sense of belonging, not to a place or a people, but to the rhythm of the house and the quiet companionship of the spirits and animals that shared it. Her gaze drifted toward the window, where the blue hour was beginning to bleed into the landscape, turning the snow-covered hills a deep, bruised violet. She noticed something odd. In the pristine, white expanse of the driveway, where the snow had fallen in a fresh, undisturbed layer since the previous night, there was a trail. She leaned closer, her breath fogging the glass. They were footprints. Not the wide, splayed prints of a deer, or the frantic scuttle of a fox. These were distinct, human-like footprints, but they were small, too small for any of the village adults. They led from the direction of the harbor, cutting a straight, purposeful line across the frost-dusted ground, heading directly toward her front door. Hanne felt a strange ripple of curiosity, a tiny fracture in the domestic serenity. She looked back at the cellar door, which remained a fraction of an inch ajar, and then back to the prints in the snow. The footprints stopped exactly at the edge of her porch, as if whoever had made them had simply vanished into the air or stepped inside without leaving a trace on the wooden planks. Bossy let out a sudden sharp chirp and stretched, his claws scraping the tile stove with a loud, metal-sharp screech. He looked toward the door, his amber eyes wide and alert, his ears twitching forward. He wasn't looking at the snow, he was looking at the hallway, his gaze fixed on the empty space just behind Hanne. She turned slowly, the warmth of the oven at her back, and a sudden, inexplicable chill prickling the nape of her neck. The hallway was empty, but as she looked down, she saw a single, tiny smudge of gray ash on the polished floor, right where the footprints in the snow would have ended. It was a small, singular mark, like a thumbprint left by someone who had just come in from a very old, very cold fire. The arrival of the blue hour. The door didn't just open, it surrendered to a violent gust of wind that swept a flurry of crystalline snow across the polished pine floor, cutting through the scent of cinnamon like a blade. Ibrahim and Beatrice spilled inside, their voices colliding in a frantic debate about the physics of the evening light. "It is not merely blue, Beatrice," Ibrahim was saying, his voice resonant and precise even as he struggled with the heavy brass latch. "It is an atmospheric scattering, a Rayleigh effect heightened by the coastal moisture. The indigo is a byproduct of the angle, not a mood." Beatrice didn't answer him. She stepped over the threshold with her chin tucked, one eye squinted shut as she framed the kitchen in an invisible rectangle. Her fingers, smudged gray with charcoal, twitched against the fabric of her coat. She wasn't looking at the warmth or the welcome. She was hunting for the exact point where the bruised violet of the Nordic twilight collided with the amber glow of Hanne's lamps. To her, the room was not a home, but a composition of competing temperatures. Ibrahim followed her, his posture so rigid he looked as though he had been carved from a single block of mahogany. His wool coat was buttoned tightly to the chin, leaving no room for a scarf, and the moment he entered the warmth, his glasses fobbed into two opaque white discs. He stood frozen for a second, blinking rapidly, his hands folded neatly in front of him in a gesture of academic deference that felt strangely out of place in a cottage that smelled of yeast and old wood. "You are both just in time," Hanne said, her voice a slow, melodic drift that seemed to pull the frantic energy out of the air. She didn't move toward them with urgency. Instead, she glided from the oven, her movements possessing a rhythmic, mindful grace. "The rolls are resting, and the tea is steepening. Please leave the cold at the door." She guided them toward the hearth with a gentle tilt of her head. Bossy, who had been a motionless sphere of orange fur on the tile stove, let out a sharp, questioning chirp. He stretched one paw toward Ibrahim, his claws kneading the air, but his amber eyes remained fixed on the space just behind the guests, the same space where Hanne had seen the smudge of ash. Ibrahim remained standing by the heavy oak table, his feet planted shoulder-width apart. He didn't sit. He observed the room with a detached, scholarly curiosity, his gaze lingering on the dried herbs hanging from the rafters and the hand-woven linens. He looked like a man cataloging a museum exhibit, his mind likely categorizing the stuga as a traditional coastal dwelling rather than a place of living warmth. "The light is failing too quickly," Beatrice muttered, her voice bright and hurried. She had moved to the window, her charcoal-stained fingers itching. She began to sketch rapidly on a small pad, her movements jerky. "The indigo is shifting into a charcoal gray. If I can't capture the transition now, the whole piece loses its tension. Hanne, do you have a lamp I can move? The shadow on the floor is too soft, it lacks definition." Hanne didn't answer immediately. She took her time, humming a low, wordless tune as she reached for the heavy ceramic mugs. The mugs were thick-walled and irregular, glazed in a deep forest green that mirrored the pines outside. She poured the tea with a steady hand, the stream of liquid steaming and fragrant. The scent of bergamot and lemon peel rose in a sudden cloud, weaving through the heavy, sweet aroma of the kanelbullar. "Tea first, Beatrice," Hanne said, her voice carrying a soft but immovable weight. "The light will be what it will be. The tea, however, is exactly as it should be." She placed a mug in front of Ibrahim. He studied the steam rising in lazy curls, then slowly reached out to take the vessel. As his fingers closed around the heated ceramic, a visible change occurred. The warmth was aggressive, forcing his grip to loosen, forcing the tension out of his knuckles. He took a slow sip, and as the bergamot hit his palate, he let out a long, shuddering sigh. His shoulders, which had been held high and tight near his ears, finally dropped an inch. The academic armor didn't vanish, but it cracked. "It is remarkably soothing," Ibrahim admitted, his voice losing some of its precision and gaining a hint of vulnerability. He looked down at the tea, the reflection of the hearth fire dancing in his newly cleared glasses. "I find that my notes on the regional folklore rarely mention the olfactory comfort of a seaside kitchen. It is a variable I had overlooked." Beatrice, however, was still fighting the room. She had moved her canvas to the center of the floor, squinting one eye, her brow furrowed in frustration. "It's gone. The blue is gone. Now it's just muddy. How can a place be so peaceful and yet so visually stubborn?" She sighed, a sound of genuine mortification, and leaned back, her charcoal-stained hand brushing against the rug. As Ibrahim shifted his weight to set his mug back on the table, his gaze dropped to the floor. He froze. There, on the edge of the woven wool rug, was a mark. It was a tiny, distinct footprint, no larger than a thumb pressed into the fibers. It wasn't a muddy print or a wet one. It was a grayish, ashen smudge, as if a very small person had stepped out of a fireplace and walked across the room. Ibrahim leaned down, his academic curiosity returning, but this time it was laced with a flicker of genuine bewilderment. He didn't mention it immediately. He looked from the print to the cellar door, which remained a fraction of an inch ajar, and then to the empty hallway. Bossy the cat suddenly leaped from the stove, landing with a soft thud beside Ibrahim. The cat didn't look at the scholar. He looked directly at the ash print, then let out a low, guttural growl that sounded like a distant engine. "Hanne," Ibrahim said, his voice returning to its measured, scholarly tone, though a slight tremor remained. "I believe you may have a guest who did not enter through the front door." Hanne paused, her hand resting on the handle of the oven. She didn't look surprised, but she didn't look relieved either. She looked toward the cellar door, where a sudden, icy draft swept upward, extinguishing one of the small candles on the sideboard. The scent of cinnamon was still there, but beneath it, for the first time, was the sharp, metal-sharp smell of old stone and deep earth. The Tomte's quiet game. Hanne didn't move toward the cellar door. Instead, she reached for the linen tea towel hanging from its brass hook, the one with the faded cornflowers, to wipe a stray splash of cinnamon syrup from the counter, but her hand closed on empty air. The hook was bare. She paused, her fingers still curled in the shape of the fabric, and looked at the spot where the towel had hung for 3 years. It hadn't slipped. The heavy linen was too coarse to slide off on its own, and there had been no gust of wind strong enough to lift it. She turned slowly, her gaze sweeping across the honey-colored wood of the kitchen. The room felt thick, as if the air had gained weight, pressing against the skin with a soft, expectant pressure. Ibrahim remained frozen, his glasses sliding slightly down the bridge of his nose, his eyes locked on the ashen footprint. He looked like a man who had found a misplaced footnote in a sacred text, fascinated but terrified of the implication. Beside him, Bossy had transitioned from a growl to a low, vibrating hum, his tail twitching in a rhythmic, hypnotic arc that mirrored the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. "I could have moved it," Hanne murmured, though she knew she hadn't. She stepped toward the dining area, her wool socks muffling her footsteps. There, draped with an impossible, precise neatness over the high back of the heavy oak chair, lay the cornflower towel. It was folded in a way Hanne never folded it, sharp architectural creases that looked as though the fabric had been pressed by a professional valet. From the shadows beneath the sideboard, a sound emerged. It wasn't a voice in the way humans spoke, but a dry, papery whisper, like a handful of autumn leaves skittering across a granite slab. It was a sound of ancient parchment and attic dust. Then came a noise that made Ibrahim jump, a sharp, rhythmic tap-tap-tap-tap of a tiny boot against the floorboards, a sound no larger than a raindrop hitting a tin roof, yet clear enough to pierce the silence. Hanne didn't gasp, she didn't even startle. Instead, she leaned her head slightly to the left, looking into the empty space where the shadows seemed a bit denser, a bit more deliberate. A soft, knowing smile touched the corners of her mouth. She didn't speak aloud, but her expression was a conversation of its own. "You've grown bold today, little one." The air in the corner seemed to shimmer, a brief ripple of warmth that smelled of old pipe tobacco and dried heather, and then the presence receded, leaving behind only the lingering sense of a mischievous, invisible observer. "Did you hear that?" Ibrahim asked, his voice a strained, scholarly whisper. He had stepped away from the footprint, though he kept his eyes on it, as if it might suddenly move. The acoustic quality of that sound, it was localized. It wasn't an echo from the cellar. "The house has its own ways of greeting guests," Hanne replied, her voice melodic and slow, the cadence of a lullaby. She walked over to the chair and retrieved the towel, smoothing the strange creases with her palm. "Some greetings are louder than others. Some are simply a matter of where we leave our linens." Across the room, the battle for the blue hour had reached its breaking point. Beatrice had been standing before her canvas for 20 minutes in a state of rigid suspension, her brush hovering millimeters from the oil. She was squinting, her one open eye darting between the window and the canvas, trying to catch the precise transition where the twilight shifted from a pale violet to that deep, impenetrable Nordic blue. But the light was a fickle thing. It didn't fade linearly, it collapsed. In a sudden, sweeping motion, the luminosity vanished, swallowed by the encroaching winter night, leaving the room in a dim, muddy haze. Beatrice froze. The brush remained suspended in the air, a single bead of cobalt blue trembling on the tip. For a moment, the silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the distant, rhythmic thrum of Bossy's purring. Beatrice looked at the canvas, a fragmented, frustrated attempt to capture a piece she couldn't quite feel, and then she studied the window, where the world had become a wall of obsidian. The perfect moment had slipped through her fingers, uncaptured and unrepeatable. Slowly, as if letting go of a heavy weight, Beatrice lowered her arm. She didn't sigh or curse. Instead, she carefully set her brushes down on the wooden pallet, the clatter of the handles against the wood sounding like a surrender. She stepped back, her shoulders dropping 3 inches from her ears. The tension that had held her since she crossed the threshold of the stuga finally snapped, replaced by a sudden, overwhelming awareness of the room's scent. The cinnamon rolls had finished baking. The air was now a thick, golden syrup of caramelized sugar, warm yeast, and the earthy depth of butter. "It's gone," Beatrice said, her voice lacking its usual bright articulation. It sounded tired, but softer. "The light, I missed it." "The light always leaves," Hanne said, moving toward the oven. "But the warmth stays. Please, come to the table." The rolls are at their peak. They gathered around the heavy oak table, the 3 of them sitting in a comfortable, heavy silence that felt shared rather than awkward. Hanne placed the platter of kanelbullar in the center, the steam rising in curling white ribbons. Ibrahim took a roll with a precision that suggested he was handling a fragile artifact, his fingers trembling slightly. As he bit into the pastry, he closed his eyes, and for a moment, the academic rigidity vanished. He looked less like a scholar and more like a man remembering a home he hadn't yet found. Beatrice ate slowly, her charcoal-stained fingers contrasting with the pale gold of the bread. She didn't talk about the painting. She simply leaned into the warmth of the room, her gaze drifting to the hearth where the fire crackled with a steady, rhythmic pulse. The silence between them wasn't a void to be filled. It was a blanket, weaving the 3 of them into the fabric of the house. As the meal wound down, Hanne stood and walked toward the hearthstone. From the platter, she took a small, crescent-shaped piece of a roll, the smallest bit, barely a mouthful. With a mindful, slow movement, she placed the offering on the flat stone beside the glowing embers. She didn't say a prayer or a spell, she simply left the gift there, a silent acknowledgement of the invisible tenant who kept the house in harmony. She had just turned back toward the table, the ghost of a smile still on her lips, when the silence of the house was shattered. There was no knock, no warning, and no footsteps on the porch. The heavy front door simply creaked open, the hinges groaning with a slow, deliberate weight. A sudden blast of freezing air surged into the hallway, carrying with it a flurry of crystalline snow that swirled across the polished floor, and the smell of the deep, frozen woods, sharp, piney, and ancient, filled the kitchen. The forest keeper's breath. The door didn't just open, it surrendered to the wind, swinging wide with a heavy, metal-sharp groan that vibrated through the floorboards. Hanne stood frozen, her hand still hovering near the hearthstone where the crescent of cinnamon roll lay as a silent offering. The sudden intrusion of the Arctic air was a physical blow, a wall of ice that swept the scent of caramelized sugar from the room and replaced it with the raw, mineral smell of frozen granite and ancient, crushed pine needles. A fine dusting of snow skittered across the polished oak floor like 1,000 tiny diamonds, settling in the grooves of the wood. From the swirling white haze of the doorway, a figure materialized. She did not walk so much as glide, her movements possessing a fluid, weightless quality that defied the friction of the floor. Lumi, the forest keeper, stepped into the warmth of the kitchen, though she brought the winter with her. She wore a cloak that seemed woven from the very essence of the solstice, shades of deep spruce and frosted silver that shifted as she moved. Her skin had the pale, translucent quality of a frozen lake, and her eyes held the stillness of a midnight forest. As she entered, the air in the stuga thickened, turning dense and syrupy, as if the room had suddenly been submerged in a warm, invisible tide. "The house is breathing," Lumi said. Her voice didn't travel from her throat so much as it echoed from the corners of the room, a cavernous, ethereal sound that seemed to vibrate in the marrow of their bones. She tilted her head slightly to the left, her gaze fixed on a point far beyond the walls of the kitchen, listening to a frequency only she could hear. The woods have paused their shivering. They are breathing in unison with the hearth tonight. Beatrice, who had been clutching her charcoal pencil like a weapon against the silence, slowly let her hand drop. The artist's shoulders, which had been held in a rigid, professional line since her arrival, finally slumped. She studied Lumi, not with the critical eye of a painter seeking a composition, but with a raw, blinking vulnerability. The need to capture the blue hour, to frame the perfection of the light, vanished. In its place was a heavy, pleasant lethargy that made her eyelids droop and her limbs feel as though they were made of warm wax. She leaned her head on her hand, her fingers smudged with gray, and let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for years. Ibrahim, usually the bastion of academic posture, had completely surrendered. He was slumped in his chair, his glasses sliding slightly down the bridge of his nose. He didn't reach to adjust them. Instead, he looked into the fire, his expression softened into something profoundly tender. The rigidity of the scholar had dissolved, leaving behind a man who looked as though he had finally put down a very heavy suitcase. "My grandfather had a courtyard," Ibrahim began. His voice had lost its measured lecture hall precision. It was now a resonant, honeyed tone, rich with the texture of memory. In the center, there was a pomegranate tree that refused to die, even when the dust storms tried to bury the city. He used to tell me that the roots of that tree reached down into the stories of the people who had lived there before us, drinking from the memories of the earth. He spoke of the smell of roasting coffee and cardamom in the early morning, of the way the heat of the desert felt like a physical weight on the skin, and the absolute, holy silence of a shaded courtyard at noon. He wasn't presenting a folklore study, he was weaving himself into the fabric of Hanne's kitchen. As he talked, the boundary between the guests and the sanctuary seemed to blur. They were no longer visitors from the city or the south, they were merely souls gathered around a fire, their identities stripping away like old paint to reveal something simpler and more honest beneath. Lumi moved among them, her hands tracing slow, flowing arcs in the air. She didn't touch them, but as her fingers passed through the space around their shoulders, a sensation of profound lightness followed. It was as if she were physically plucking away the invisible threads of anxiety, the deadlines, the failed canvases, the loneliness of a foreign land. Hanne watched her, humming a low, wordless tune, feeling the harmony of the room reach a peak. Bossy, the cat, let out a long, rattling purr from the tile stove, his eyes half closed in a state of total feline bliss. "You carry the world on your backs like stones in a pack," Lumi whispered, her voice echoing softly. "Leave them by the door." The winter does not recognize the weight of your worries. It only recognizes the warmth of your breath. Beatrice closed her eyes, a small, genuine smile touching her lips. For the first time since she had arrived, she wasn't thinking about how the scene would look on a canvas. She was simply existing in the scent of cinnamon and old cedar, listening to the cadence of Ibrahim's voice. The room had become a cocoon, a place where time had ceased to be a linear progression and had instead become a circling, gentle pool. Ibrahim's story drifted into a peaceful haze, his words becoming slower, more melodic. He spoke of the way the wind sounded in the palms, a sound that reminded him of the ocean, even though the sea was leagues away. The three of them, Hanne, Ibrahim, and Beatrice, sat in a shared, hypnotic trance, bound together by the storytelling and the presence of the forest keeper. The warmth of the room felt absolute, an impenetrable fortress against the void of the solstice night. However, as the conversation dipped into a comfortable, humming silence, Lumi suddenly stopped her flowing movements. Her head snapped toward the hearth, and the ethereal softness of her expression vanished, replaced by a sharp, keen alertness. She leaned closer to the fire, her pale eyes narrowing as she observed the embers. The glow, which had been a steady, rhythmic pulse, seemed to flicker unevenly, as if something were drawing the heat away from the center. "The fire is hungry," Lumi whispered, the echo in her voice now carrying a sliver of ice. "And the night is hungrier still." Hanne frowned, glancing at the logs. She had fed the fire plenty, and the wood was a high-grade birch that should have lasted until dawn. Yet she noticed that the edges of the room were growing darker, the shadows stretching longer and deeper than they should have at this hour. The warmth that had felt so thick and protective was beginning to thin, a subtle chill creeping in from the corners of the ceiling. Lumi turned to Hanne, her gaze heavy with a warning that chilled the blood. "The great sleep is arriving early this year, Hanne Sorensen. It does not merely come for the earth, it comes for the light. The fire is dying faster than it should, and the cold that follows is not the kind that can be fought with wool and tea." As the words left Lumi's lips, a sudden, sharp crack echoed from the chimney, like a bone snapping. The fire didn't go out, but the flames suddenly turned a pale, ghostly blue, and the temperature in the room plummeted 10 degrees in a single heartbeat. The cozy sanctuary had shifted. The silence was no longer a blanket, but a veil, and something on the other side of it had just noticed they were there. The embers' final glow. The blue flames did not flicker. They stood rigid, like shards of frozen glass piercing the center of the hearth. Hanne felt the sudden, heavy pull in her limbs, a gravity that didn't belong to the earth, but to the deep, marrow-deep cold of the great sleep. It was as if her blood had turned to thick syrup, slowing her pulse to a rhythmic thrum that echoed the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. She tried to step forward to tend the fire, but her boots felt as though they were cast in lead, rooting her to the scrubbed pine floor. The air in the room had grown dense, smelling of old snow and the sharp tang of a coming storm, pressing against her skin with an invisible, suffocating weight. Beside her, Ibrahim had stopped mid-sentence, his hand still poised in the air as if to emphasize a point that had been stolen by the frost. He didn't look frightened so much as profoundly subdued. He adjusted his glasses with a slow, mechanical precision, his movements mirroring the sluggishness that had seized Hanne. He looked toward the blue fire, his deep voice now a hushed, measured vibration. "It is as if the room is forgetting how to be warm," he murmured, the words drifting like frost smoke. He didn't move to help. He simply stood there, his shoulders dropping, his academic rigor dissolving into a quiet, wide-eyed surrender to the inexplicable. Beatrice had ceased her squinting, her charcoal pencil frozen an inch from the sketchpad. She wasn't trying to frame the scene anymore. Instead, she was leaning back into the wingback chair, her breath coming in shallow, visible puffs of white. The artistic tension that had defined her since her arrival, the frantic need to capture the perfect blue hour, had vanished, replaced by a heavy velvet lethargy. She studied Hanne, her expression softened, the sharp edges of her perfectionism blunted by the oppressive stillness. The two of them, along with Ibrahim, began to sync their breathing, a slow, undulating tide of inhalation and exhalation that seemed to tether them together in the darkening room. Bassi, who had been the sovereign at the tile stove, let out a long, vibrating purr that sounded like a distant engine. He didn't flee the cold. Instead, he curled himself into a tight ginger sphere, his paws tucked beneath his chin. The sound of his purring became the only heartbeat the room had left, a low-frequency anchor that kept the three humans from drifting entirely into the void. Hanne watched the cat, feeling a strange, detached sense of kinship with him. They were all just small animals seeking a center, a point of warmth in a world that was rapidly turning to stone. Lumi remained by the hearth, her ethereal presence the only thing that seemed unaffected by the heaviness. She didn't offer a solution or a spell, she simply watched them with an expression of ancient, patient sorrow. Her flowing hands moved in a slow arc, as if she were weaving the remaining warmth of the room into a thin, protective veil. The blue flames began to recede, not by dying, but by sinking deeper into the ash, turning from a ghostly azure to a dull, pulsing crimson. The temperature didn't rise, but the aggressive bite of the cold softened into a heavy, drowsy blanket. As the fire sank, the external world, the harbor, the salt-sprayed docks, the distant cries of the gulls faded into a memory. The stuga felt as though it had been lifted from the coast and placed in the center of a void, a lone island of cedar and wool. Hanne looked at her friends and felt a sudden, piercing swell of affection. Ibrahim's face was smoothed of its formality, his features open and vulnerable in the dim light. Beatrice looked peaceful, her eyes half closed, the charcoal smudge on her cheek looking like a mark of honor. In this moment of shared fragility, Hanne realized she had finally achieved it. She had created a sanctuary not through the perfection of a recipe or the tidiness of a room, but through the shared experience of surrender. She felt the need to touch something real, something that carried the memory of heat. Slowly, with a concentrated effort that felt like lifting a mountain, Hanne raised her hands and rubbed her palms together. She could still feel the ghost of the oven's warmth in her skin, a lingering scent of cinnamon and toasted sugar that clung to her fingertips. The friction of her skin against skin was the only thing that felt urgent. She closed her eyes and breathed in. The scent of the house, old paper, dried herbs, and the faint, sharp tang of the stove wrapping around her like a shroud. In the corner of the room, just beyond the reach of the dying embers, there was a shift in the shadows. Hanne couldn't see him, but she felt the sudden, warm weight of Nisi's presence. It was a sensation like a heavy quilt being draped over a shivering shoulder. There was a rhythmic, tiny tap, the sound of a small boot hitting the floorboards, and a feeling of silent, invisible guardianship. Nisi was there, ensuring that while the fire might fade, the harmony of the house remained intact. The spirit of the hearth was not fighting the great sleep with fire, but with a quiet, stubborn insistence on belonging. The heaviness in Hanne's limbs shifted from a burden to a luxury. The pull of sleep was no longer a threat, but an invitation. She felt herself sinking, her body losing its battle with the velvet stillness. She drifted toward the sofa, her movements fluid and slow, as if she were swimming through honey. She didn't want to wake Ibrahim or Beatrice, she wanted to preserve this frozen moment of absolute peace. She lowered herself onto the soft cushions, the fabric smelling of lavender and old wool, and felt her consciousness begin to fray at the edges. As she lay there, the last ember in the hearth gave a final, sharp pop, a tiny spark that flew upward before vanishing into the chimney. The light in the room dimmed until only the faintest glow remained, a deep, bruised purple that blurred the lines between the furniture and the walls. Hanne's eyelids became impossibly weighted, the world narrowing down to the sound of Bossy's purring and the rhythmic, distant sigh of the wind against the eaves. She felt a profound sense of completion, a realization that the slow living she had sought was not the absence of struggle, but the ability to rest in the midst of it. Just as she slipped past the threshold of wakefulness into a deep and dreamless slumber, she felt a sensation of lightness. A soft, unseen hand, smelling of pine needles and ancient earth, gently tucked a heavy wool blanket around her shoulders, sealing in the last of her body heat. It was a gesture of such tenderness that it brought a final, ghost-like smile to her lips. The house was silent, the guests were still, and the great sleep had claimed the sanctuary, turning it into a cocoon of silver and shadow. Outside, the first stars blinked open over the frozen harbor, cold and indifferent. The snow continued to pile against the door, erasing the small ashen footprints that had led the visitor inside. The village was a graveyard of white, held in the grip of the solstice, yet inside the stuga, the three humans and the cat slept in a synchronicity that defied the frost. They were held in a stasis of warmth and trust, protected by the unseen hands of the house and the woods. In the deepest part of the night, when the silence became absolute, a floorboard creaked near the cellar door. A small gray figure stood there, watching the sleeping forms with eyes that held the reflection of 1,000 winters. He didn't move to wake them. He simply stood guard, his tiny chest heaving with a slow, rhythmic breath. He studied the extinguished hearth, and then at the window, where the frost had formed intricate, crystalline patterns that looked like a map of a forgotten city. Nisi leaned forward, his voice a dry, papery whisper that barely disturbed the air, a sound like autumn leaves skittering across a stone porch. He spoke not to the humans, but to the cold that pressed against the glass. "You may touch the walls, but you shall not touch the heart," he whispered.